Objective 1, I can describe the gross anatomy of the spinal cord and its protection and support from the body. All right, so there's a couple of things you want to focus on here. We're just looking at the general composition of the spinal cord. We want to identify the 5 anatomic subdivisions of the spinal cord and how they associate with the spinal nerves, and then explain how the cauda equina arises in development. So first thing, our spinal cord extends inferiorly from the brain's medulla through the vertebral canal, which most of us are fairly familiar with. The one thing that is different, however, is that the spinal cord as an adult ends at the L1 vertebra. So that means that's the very first vertebrae of the lumbar, which at the very end there is going to be called the conus medullaris. There are 2 widened regions through the spinal cord. One that's the cervical enlargement, which has a lot of neurons that are going to be innervating for the upper limbs. And then farther down we have the lumbar enlargement, which also contains neurons that are innervating now for the lower limbs. The spinal cord can be subdivided into 5 parts from top to bottom. So similarly to how our vertebrae can be separated into 5 different parts, we do the same thing with the spinal cord. So our cervical section is going to be those 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. Now notice, normally our cervix, or the cervical section of our vertebrae, is going to have 7 vertebrae, right? So the one thing that's different here is that we have 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves versus those 7 vertebrae. Now the rest all match. So 12 for our thoracic, so we have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, same number as our vertebrae, and then the sacrum is going to have 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and then the coccygeal part, which is going to be for the coccyx, which is fused together, is going to have just 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. So you can see here in our picture, you can go ahead and take a look. There, find our conus medullaris, which is going to be the end, ending there at that L1 vertebrae versus at the end of the vertebral column. And you'll also notice that we've got our number of nerves there going C1 through C8. Those are our spinal nerves. And again, T1 through T12, and then L1 through L5, and our S1 through S5, and our very last part being that 1 pair of CO1. Or the coccygeal 1 pair of spinal nerves. All right, so the spinal cord gross anatomy, you'll notice that the parts do not exactly align with the vertebrae names. The vertebrae growth actually continues after the spinal cord growth is complete. So our spinal cord goes ahead and finishes up, and then our vertebrae or our vertebral column is going to keep growing. So it's going to get longer than our spinal cord. The rootlets from parts L2 or lumbar vertebrae 2 and below extend inferiorly, known as the cauda equina. So if you remember, if we go back a couple slides, we can see that we had a section where we stopped, but there were still spinal nerves that were continuing down into the sacrum and that coccygeal pair of spinal nerves. So as they extend from that L1 section, it's going to be called the cauda equina. These different little thin strands that are coming down, these nerves that are coming down, also have a thin strand of pia, or a protective tissue, attaching onto that end portion at the L1 called the conus medullaris all the way down to the coccyx, and we call that the filum terminal. So the spinal nerves are named for where they're attached on the spinal cord part, as we suggested, starting with the C1 nerve all the way down to the very end, which is that CO1 nerve, or that CO1 nerve. So notice that the spinal cord size and shape varies along its length, but is roughly cylindrical, and we'll see that in our lab. And a cross section is going to go ahead and show grooves on the front, called the anterior median fissure, and also on the back, the posterior median sulcus. So you can see that anterior portion here as the anterior median fissure, and then the sulcus on the posterior section of the spinal cord. All right, so you want to think about which parts of the spinal cord are enlarged and what functions do these enlargements serve. So remember, we were talking about those 2 different pieces that had nerves innervating them for the upper limbs and the lower limbs. And then what is the name of the inferior most cervical spinal nerve? Of course, that's going to be our coccygeal 1, or that CO1 nerve. All right, moving on to the protection and support of the spinal cord. So we want to describe the locations and function of the spinal cord meninges. These are the same layers that we find within our cranium and the layers that are protecting those connective tissue pieces that are connecting our brain. And then we want to compare and contrast the three spaces associated with the spinal cord meninges. All right, so the spinal cord meninges, same as we saw in the cranium, we've got the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. So the pia mater is going to be adhering directly onto the spinal cord. It's made of elastic and collagen fibers. It has denticulate ligaments that are lateral extensions of the pia that help suspend the spinal cord within the vertebral column. Again, of course, we have that filum terminal, that's the pia anchoring on the inferior end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. Right, because the spinal cord doesn't grow all the way down through the vertebral column. That next one is going to be our arachnoid mater. So what we're doing is we're moving from the inferior most level of the meninges, right on the spinal cord, out to the most superficial layer that's going to be right below the bones of the vertebral column. So in the middle there, we're going to have the arachnoid mater, which is web-like and external to the pia, of course. We have something called the arachnoid trabeculae, which are these extensions that are going to be coming out of the membrane, similar to those denticulate ligaments of the pia mater. In between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, we're going to have this subarachnoid space where we see cerebral spinal fluid flowing through. So we have the same space, the subarachnoid space was also within the cranium to allow for that cerebral spinal fluid to flow through. Above that, the arachnoid mater, we're going to have what's called the dura mater, which is super tough. Think of it like when you dissect the muscles, there were some of those really dense connective tissue that was covering the muscles that you kind of had to peel back, not the tendons or the ligaments, but that tough layer that would be covering the muscles. That's very similar to what we find covering the spinal cord and also our cranium. So this layer of dense regular connective tissue helps stabilize the spinal cord. And so again, we have a subdural space that's between the dura and the arachnoid. Okay, so we have the subarachnoid space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater for the cerebrospinal fluid. Then between the arachnoid and the dura mater, we have the subdural space. And then between the dura and the vertebrae, we're going to have what's called the epidural space. And this is for adipose and areolar connective tissue and blood vessels. So we can see that here in our picture. Going ahead and looking a little bit closer, if we start off with our pia mater here, right next to the spinal cord. And then we can go ahead and see the subarachnoid space and the arachnoid mater above that. And then, of course, that subdural space that's between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. And then the epidural space filled with that adipose and blood vessels and areolar connective tissue called the epidural space. And this is just another picture of that, right? So we can see there is our spinal cord, of course, right here. And then we're going to find that the pia mater is right next to it. Find our subarachnoid space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. And then our subdural space in between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. And of course, then you would have your epidural space that's not shown here because we do not have the vertebral column shown. All right. So just remembering the names of the fluid-filled space between the two inner meninges, right, our subarachnoid space for the cerebral spinal fluid, which is super important for protection of our entire nervous system. And then which meningeal layer is the thinnest and most delicate? That is going to be the pia mater right next to the spinal cord. All right, thanks, guys.